When George Washington gave his farewell address to the American people in 1796, he warned that we should not get too involved in foreign affairs. With few exceptions, United States foreign policy had followed his advice. However, in 1898, the United States broke from that tradition and declared war on Spain. The Spanish-American War did not last very long, but it did have many important consequences. After the Monroe Doctrine was issued in 1823, the United States wanted to limit European influence in the Western Hemisphere by preventing any new European colonies from being established there. Cuba and Puerto Rico had long been Spanish colonies in Latin America, and in 1868 rebels in Cuba had started a war of independence against Spain. By the 1890s, the United States and Cuba had become closely linked. Not only is Cuba only 90 miles south of Florida, but Cuba had exported much of its sugar to the United States, and American investments in Cuban plantations, mines, and railroads had reached $50 million. Even though the United States had remained neutral in the Cuban uprising against Spain, many Americans began to openly support the rebels. What led to the U.S. declaration of war in 1898 was America's long-standing economic and strategic interest in Cuba and the growing support for the Cuban independence movement, which was fueled by how the American press was covering events in Cuba. The nation's two major newspaper publishers at the time were William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer. In order to attract more readers and sell more newspapers, both publishers began to practice what is known as yellow journalism. Yellow journalism is the kind of journalism that sensationalizes and exaggerates. The American press portrayed the events in Cuba as horrific atrocities committed by the Spanish. While there was no doubt much suffering, some of the stories that were published were simply invented. The calls to intervene in Cuba's civil war had been growing since 1895, but reached a fever pitch in 1898. In January, President William McKinley sent an American warship, the USS Maine, to the Cuban port in Havana in case Americans in Cuba had to be evacuated. In February of that year, the New York Journal, one of William Randolph Hearst's newspapers, published a letter intercepted by a Cuban agent that was written by the Spanish ambassador to the U.S., Enrique de Lome. In the de Lome letter, the Spanish ambassador described McKinley as weak, and many Americans were outraged by the insult. Then, on February 5th, an explosion sank the USS Maine, killing 260 crew members. The cause of the explosion still remains somewhat of a mystery, but in the tense atmosphere of jingoism or extreme nationalism, newspapers were quick to put the blame on a Spanish mine. The slogan, "Remember the Maine," became the rallying cry for a declaration of war against Spain, which happened on April 24, 1898. As part of the declaration of war, Congress added the Teller Amendment, which stated that the United States would not annex Cuba. The war was fought on two main fronts. In Asia, American naval forces under the command of Commodore George Dewey sailed to the Spanish colony of the Philippines with orders to destroy the Spanish fleet there, which he did fairly easily. When Dewey defeated the Spanish fleet, 20,000 American troops sailed from San Francisco to the Philippines. On the way, they seized the Pacific island of Guam, another Spanish colony. Commodore Dewey then enlisted the help of a Filipino revolutionary leader by the name of Emilio Aguinaldo to launch a guerrilla war against the Spanish troops there. Aguinaldo's forces took control of most of the islands in the Philippines, while the American forces seized the capital of Manila. The war was also fought in Cuba. Here, the U.S. Navy placed a blockade on Cuba to prevent any supplies or reinforcements from coming in. By the way, this won't be the last time that the U.S. places a blockade on Cuba. In June of 1898, about 17,000 American troops landed in Cuba. Notable among them was Teddy Roosevelt, who we talk a lot about in the next chapter. Teddy Roosevelt was part of a cavalry unit known as the Rough Riders that fought in the famous Battle of San Juan Hill. After about a month of fighting, in which more Americans died of tropical diseases than of battle, Spanish forces surrendered. The whole war was over in less than 4 months. As the official treaty to end the war was being negotiated, many Americans began to voice opinions about the issue of American imperialism. After the war, there was an intense debate over whether or not the United States should annex the former Spanish colonies, particularly the Philippines. Those who supported the annexation of the Philippines relied on the three G's, gold, God, and glory, to support their positions. The anti-imperialists also had their arguments. Those opposed to the annexation of the Philippines argued that maintaining an empire was too expensive. Labor leaders like Samuel Gompers feared competition from cheaper Filipino labor would drive down wages. Many opponents of annexation also pointed out that imposing American might on foreign lands and native peoples violated American principles of freedom and self-determination. In December 1898, Spain and the United States signed the Treaty of Paris, officially ending the war. In the treaty, Cuba had become an independent nation. Puerto Rico and Guam became possessions of the United States, and the U.S. agreed to pay Spain $20 million for the Philippines. Although Cuba was an independent nation, the United States still aimed to control their affairs. Congress passed the Platt Amendment in 1901. This amendment, which was part of an Army funding bill, said the following: Cuba could not enter into any treaties with another nation without U.S. approval. Cuba also had to allow the U.S. to buy or lease a naval base in Guantanamo Bay, which we still have. Cuba had to keep its debt low, and the United States had the right to intervene in Cuba if its interests were threatened. In summary, in 1898, the U.S. declared war on Spain. The causes of the Spanish-American War were American support for Cuban rebels, yellow journalism, and the sinking of the USS Maine. After the war, the United States debated whether or not to annex former Spanish colonies, especially the Philippines. The war resulted in the United States gaining overseas territory in Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Although Cuba was independent, the United States still took steps to control its domestic and foreign affairs. The big result of the Spanish-American War was that for the first time, the United States started to emerge as more of a world power, which is going to shape the rest of our history up to now. Alright, that's it. The end.